Started here, so we're not doing Martin Niemöller today. I'm going to move him to May and then do another one on the large idea of scapegoating after that with some René Girard, French literary critic and sociologist. So today I switched it because a lot of the news about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. I don't think I've thought about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 since I was in 5th grade in U.S. history, and I briefly, here you go, Greg, studied it then. Until a couple weeks ago, I was in Philadelphia, and I read a lot on the Alien and Sedition Acts when I was reading up on early Constitution, the presidency of John Adams, that transition from Adams to Jefferson. So I was learning more about it, and then lo and behold, it comes up this week for the first time since World War II. So one of the most controversial measures taken by the federal government in its relatively early days were those Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The laws expelled alien residents without due process and censored the free press. After the Federalists lost the election of 1800, 3 of those acts were repealed or just allowed to expire. Today, one of those 4 laws remain in effect. That's the Alien Enemies Act. So Congress passed the Alien Sedition Acts in the context of the 1798 Quasi-War. Anybody familiar with the Quasi-War? So French warships had captured numerous American merchant ships before Congress rescinded its treaties with France on July 7, 1798. The conflict was never formally declared a war, hence the Quasi-War, and it mostly took place in the West Indies. So that kind of leads up to eventually, before the War of 1812, with the British, they're kind of pressing American sailors on merchant ships into the British Navy. America's like, well, that's a jerk move, Britain. And that's what kind of eventually gets the War of 1812. Kind of some similar stuff happening with the Quasi-War, because no one really thought America was a real nation at that point. We can do what we want to them because they're new, they're small. Let's see how far we can push it. So President John Adams and his Federalist Party, which controlled Congress, sought aggressive action to protect American interests. Thomas Jefferson and his supporters argued for a different solution to the conflict. So if you remember, Adams and Jefferson, they respected each other, but they didn't like each other. They were like their true frenemies kind of thing. You think about how the last few elections have been really kind of some nasty messages and campaign ads. Read some of the campaign ads from the election of 1800. It's pretty rough too. They really didn't like each other. They had completely different philosophies of government. Jefferson wanted to put more of the government into the hands of all the people. And Adams was like, have you met people? Probably not a good idea. So they really didn't like each other. Adams really didn't want Thomas Jefferson's Republicans to kind of take control. So a lot of these acts were also meant to kind of keep themselves in power and to put down any dissenting voices. So 4 laws passed at the start of the conflict in 1798 as wartime measures that came to be known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalist Congress passed the acts over opposition from the Jeffersonian Republicans. The Sedition Act, which outlawed printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, or malicious writing about the government, was aimed at censoring and punishing critics of Adams and the Federalist Party. So they're using this kind of war to give an excuse of, hey, you can't criticize us, what we're doing here, we're going to shut you down. The Naturalization Act of 1798 sought to limit the naturalization, the process of becoming a U.S. citizen by those not born in the U.S., of aliens or non-citizens, while the Alien Act and Alien Enemies Act controlled the status of aliens in the U.S. The United States and France settled their conflict, this quasi-war in 1800, and 3 of the 4 acts expired or were repealed. The Alien Enemies Act, however, remains in effect today, and it deals with the status of aliens in the United States during a war. The act has not been used since World War II. So we'll talk about the 3 expired acts real quick. So the first, the Naturalization Act. That was the first one, June 18th, 1978. Congress sets rules for naturalization of citizenship under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 of the Constitution, which reads in part, that Congress shall have power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. The Naturalization Act of 1798 updated a previous act to expand the residency from 5 to 14 years, and for eligible aliens to declare their intent to become citizens at least 5 years in advance. So you get a long time period there. Eligibility for citizenship was limited to free white persons who had good moral character. Not sure who decides that. I'm not sure half the members of that Congress back then would apply. Maybe not even today either. I don't know. The Naturalization Act of 1802 replaced this act. It expanded citizenship to certain children of naturalized citizens and to some children of U.S. citizens born outside the U.S. That's why if you're born in Germany because your parents are stationed over there, you're still a U.S. citizen. That all comes down to the Naturalization Act of 1802. The Alien Act, also known as the Alien Friends Act, came June 25th. Congress regulates the status of aliens under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause. That's always up to a lot of interpretation, which grants Congress the power to, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So under the Alien Act, the president could deport any alien considered, quote, dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States or conducting treasonable or secret machinations against the government. So Congress let that act expire in March 1801. So that's out. Then you have the Sedition Act, July 14. That's probably the most controversial. Unlike the Naturalization and Alien Act, the President and Congress did not have a clear constitutional grant of power for the Sedition Act. They did it anyway. The Federalists called the act a war measure in the undeclared conflict with France. Remember, it's not officially a war. Congress never declared it a war. It's a quasi-war. So Section 1 made it illegal for people to combine or conspire together with intent to oppose any measure or measures of the government of the United States. So basically, if you want to talk about, hey, we need to repeal this law, we want to protest this, now against the law. Section 2 forbid writing, printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writings or writings against the government of the United States. Both sections conflicted with the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech, free press, the right to gather, rights to assemble and petition the government. The acts proved to be unpopular and a leading cause of John Adams' defeat in the 1800 presidential election. So it expired in 1801. So people kind of saw, okay, you have this war going on here, but now you're basically saying you can't say the government's not making the right choice. You can't in any way criticize the government. People did not like that. It felt to them a bit tyrannical. They had just fought a war to not have that anymore. So John Adams was extremely unpopular. He lost the election. Jefferson became the third president. So Adams was not real happy, but he did that peaceful transfer of power. Even though he hated Jefferson and all he stood for, there on inauguration day, he was there, and they exchanged powers. One of those first early tests of the U.S. government, is democracy going to hold? This is a big experiment, right? And you have one group who's wanted to stay in power, even went so far as to create laws saying you cannot criticize us to stay in power, still lost, had the transfer of power, democracy survived. So everything old, new again. We've always talked about threats to democracy. U.S. government is a new kind of thing. It's always kind of on the edge of a knife with every election, every president, every Congress. How are we going to live in to this idea of a republic? And it was tested very early on in 1800, but the Constitution held. So let's talk about acts that are still in effect. The Alien Enemies Act, which was made July 6, 1798. In addition to its grant of powers under the necessary and proper clause, Congress has the exclusive ability to declare a state of war under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Remember, the president can send people into conflicts. They can direct troops, but only Congress has the power to enact a war. If you remember all your civics class lessons. So the Alien Enemies Act goes into effect, quote, whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government. So now you got some interesting things here, like how you define what, right? What would be considered a foreign nation? Does it have to be an act of that nation, an act of that government? Can it just be some random citizens of that nation who aren't acting on behalf of the government? Which is why the CIA often sends people to say, hey, we're going to scrub you because we are going to disavow you if you get caught because we don't want you to have done this as an act of the United States government, right? So you have some wiggle room there of what does it mean to have an incursion, what does it mean predatory incursion or invasion. So under the Act, the President publicly declares that, quote, all natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government may be detained, relocated, or removed from the United States as alien enemies. After the proclamation, the Act specifies, quote, it shall be the duty of the several courts of the United States and of each state having criminal jurisdiction to apprehend aliens for court appearances. The Alien Enemies Act was used during 3 conflicts: the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. Whether it could be used outside of a declared war or against parties other than a nation or federal government has been a matter of recent debate since the Act's clear language restricts its use to narrow ways. So you have to argue that somehow, if there's not a declared war, that there's a predatory incursion done by a nation or that nation's government. The Supreme Court considered a challenge to the Enemies Act in 1948 in Luedecke v. Watkins. A divided Supreme Court held that President Harry Truman could still take actions under the Act shortly after World War II, after it had already been invoked against a German national, reasoning that it was not the judiciary's place to second-guess the president on a matter as political as when a war terminates and wartime authorities expire. So you already had the Alien Enemies Act happening in World War II. That's how you had the internment of Japanese, German Americans. Luedecke was then caught up in that after the so-called war ended, but the Supreme Court said, hey, with the judiciary, we are not going to make it a political decision about when the war is officially over. That's not our role. We can only define whether this fits into a constitutional answer. So when Congress passed the Alien Enemies Act in 1798, we need to remember that back then, the United States had no immigration law and only kind of a nascent criminal law. The country didn't have any federal intelligence or law enforcement agencies. So things were a bigger threat. You didn't really no idea who was doing what, because you had no criminal law enforcement trying to figure those things out. Compare that to today, entire sections of the Immigration, Criminal, and Intelligence Codes are dedicated to preventing and rooting out espionage, sabotage, and other malign activities, irrespective of the citizenship or ethnicity of the perpetrator. Hundreds and thousands of federal employees, probably less now, work in agencies dedicated to protecting the homeland and national security. These agencies have surveillance and other specialized tools for identifying when individuals may be conspiring with a foreign power against the United States. So sometimes, even the last several years, we have arrested people that the CIA or the FBI says these are spies of Russia or whatever. We have the tools now to try to root those people out as individuals. Back then, they had no such tools, and they knew they might be a threat, so they did the let's grab the entire big kind of net. It's kind of like trolling in the ocean, right? You want to get 2 or 3 kinds of fish. You end up getting 15 kinds of fish. But that's the way it goes, because that's your only option when you're kind of trolling with a big net. That's what they were doing at the time, because they didn't have the capacity to do single-line fishing, so to speak. They didn't have the law enforcement, the intelligence operations to figure out who are the good, who are the enemies, who are the spies. They just grabbed everyone. It's a brand new country, brand new threat, really first real outside threat to the country. They're trying to figure it out. Today, it's a little bit different. We have a lot of law enforcement, several different branches of law enforcement. So here's the big question then. Do the terms invasion and predatory incursion have to be taken literally, or could the president proclaim a rhetorical invasion, a rhetorical war? We've heard about the war on drugs, right? It's never a declared war, but we use that language. We even sometimes invoke some wartime powers to enact that. So as the Supreme Court and past presidents have acknowledged, the Alien Enemies Act is a wartime authority enacted and implemented under the war power. When the 5th Congress passed the law, and then later the Wilson administration defended it in court during World War I, they did so on the understanding that non-citizens with connections to a foreign belligerent could be, quote, treated as prisoners of war under the rules of war under the law of nations. In the Constitution, other late 1700 statutes, the term invasion is used literally, typically to refer to large-scale attacks. The term predatory incursion is also used literally in writings of that period to refer to slightly smaller attacks, like the 1781 raid on Richmond led by American defector Benedict Arnold. So you have kind of what that term literally means in writings of the period. Today, some anti-immigration politicians and groups urge a non-literal reading of invasion and predatory incursion so that the Alien Enemies Act can be invoked in response to unlawful migration and cross-border narcotics trafficking, i.e. war on drugs. These politicians and groups view the Alien Enemies Act as kind of a turbocharged deportation authority. But their proposed reading of the law is at odds with centuries of legislative, presidential, and judicial practice, all of which confirm that the Alien Enemies Act is a wartime authority. So this has been kind of talked about over the last several years. It just got invoked this past week by President Trump to quickly deport or detain members of a Venezuelan gang. So his use of the act will most likely go to the Supreme Court. A federal judge just delayed it by 14 days. His argument is doing this can cause lasting damage to those affected, and delaying it will cause no lasting damage to the government. So let's figure all this out before we just do things. So it'll go up through the channels, and the Supreme Court is going to have to rule on this because it's a lesser known law that has already had challenges throughout its time. And it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules. Because on the Supreme Court, you have a conservative majority, but that conservative majority are what's called originalists. So originalists try their best, in theory, to go strictly with what the Constitution says as it's written. They don't try to interpret it for our context. Other judges might be more contextualists that try to say, okay, here's what they meant at the time, and here's how what they meant applies to today. Let me give you an example in terms of biblical translating. So the New American Standard Bible tries really, really hard to translate the word literally from the Hebrew. So you might have something called like the hand of God will uphold you, because the Hebrew is literally like yod. Now yod means hand, but in the Hebrew kind of dialect language, it kind of, because the hand is where your power comes from, it usually means kind of power. So the NASB tries really hard to go literally word for word and stick to that. The New Revised Standard Version tries to say, okay, what were they actually meaning? What did these words mean then? How can we translate that meaning into the same language today? So where the NASB may say the hand of God will uphold you, the NRSV might say the power of God will uphold you. See how that difference there? So it's a matter of interpretation. One's not right or wrong, but you can't be so stuck in either translation, which is why I say when you read the Bible and you really want to study it, never rely on one translation, because they each have to make larger philosophical decisions, and you can't always get all the meaning through that one translation. Because sometimes, wow, that use of the word hand helps you make more sense, but other times that doesn't help you. So you want to look at both. So the contextualist jurists are going to try to look at, okay, what is their meaning early on? Now, the originalists will say you can't possibly know their meaning because you weren't there. You can't talk to them. You are putting your meaning onto them in their words, and that's a slippery slope, right? If you can say, I can interpret what they meant. On the other hand, sticking to strict literal interpretation can be problematic as well, because so much has changed today. Think about phones. Phones 50 years ago, you did a little dial-up thing. Now you use the word phone, you have a computer in your hand. So if you have a law about a phone and the only word is phone, you can have some challenges because now I can do with a phone they never intended that I'd be able to do with a phone. So there's some back and forth. It'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with this, because the majority who are originalists, sticking with the literal translation, it'd be hard for them to argue that with this new kind of being less literal. So will they cross their normal philosophical bounds more for a political agenda or not? Both sides do that sometimes. Because sometimes the liberal justice is like, I'm going to stick to a very literal translation here, where the originalists like, well, often you do it this way. Justices aren't perfect either. So, what are some of the major concerns historically with the Act? The Fifth Amendment protects U.S. citizens and immigrants against discrimination and right violations perpetrated by the federal government. The courts typically strike down policies that discriminate based on a suspect classification, such as race or ancestry, and policies that infringe on those fundamental rights. Lots of laws have been struck down on that basis of the Fifth Amendment. The Alien Enemies Act clearly discriminates against immigrants based on their country of citizenship and, more broadly, based on their ancestry. The breadth of the law's discrimination is apparent on the face of the law and from its history. By its text, the Alien Enemies Act covers not only the citizens of a foreign belligerent, but also the natives, or individuals who were born in the enemy state, but renounced their citizenship and no longer owe allegiance to that state. The law's application to natives clarifies the law's focus on birth heritage and its conflation of the ancestry with disloyalty in wartime. So in the decades following World War II, when Congress and the executive branch apologized for Japanese, German, and Italian internment, they recognized that immigrants had been targeted, regulated, and interned under the Alien Enemies Act based on their ancestry. Basically, it's, well, you've been here for a while, but you were born an Italian. We can't trust you. You were born a German. We can't trust you. You come from Japan. We got to put you in these internment camps. So largely overall, the government has apologized for that and said, that was not right. That was illegal. We shouldn't have done that. It doesn't necessarily make things better for them, but sometimes getting that apology kind of helps you know, okay, a wrong was done to me. Kind of like the Catholic Church eventually apologizing for its role in upholding the Nazi regime, or its role in not doing a good job protecting children from sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Sometimes you need to hear that apology. So the U.S. government judiciary has said, yeah, that was bad, shouldn't have done that. The Alien Enemies Act also runs afoul of the right to be free from indefinite civil detention, as recognized by the Supreme Court case in 2001, I'm not going to try to say that name, versus Davis opinion. Wartime detentions are necessarily indefinite, as states do not negotiate the length of their hostilities at the outset of a conflict. So during World War II, some immigrants were interned for more than 10 years, even though they were civilians and were never charged with any unlawful activity. More broadly, the Alien Enemies Act conflicts the central theme of American law and ethos, the right to be judged as an individual, particularly for high-stakes decisions such as detention or deportation. Across U.S. history, only one other law authorized identity-based deportations. That law, the Geary Act of 1892, was passed as part of the Chinese exclusion, and it reflects another shameful chapter of U.S. history that has been the subject of congressional and presidential apologies, not unlike internment under the Alien Enemies Act. So these things have happened before. Usually later we say, that was right, that was bad. And here's where it always gets interesting. Often people can have the same value or the same end goal, but disagree on how you implement it. For instance, I think probably most people would say we do not want violent gang members from Venezuela in the U.S. committing crimes. Generally, I think everybody's on board with that, right? It's how then do you legally and humanely affect that change? Kind of like most people say we do not want more shootings in schools, but they can disagree with how you make that happen. Whether it's more security, more gun control, more security officers, more mental health. There's a whole gamut of ways people think they want to achieve that ends, but across the spectrum, people have the same value of protecting kids in school. Just how you do it may be different. Here's an example. Probably most people are like, we don't want these violent criminals in the country. But what's the best way to remove them? Because every decision often plays the dominoes. Because if you allow this, what's next? What's the next step down the line? How does that affect another law? For example, I was asked recently after church one day, somebody asked a question because they heard somebody else, do Jews get to go to heaven, right? It's a common question about, the Jewish faith. If you don't believe in Jesus the Messiah, can you go to heaven? So I always answer that, yes, they go. You know why? Because if you say they don't, you have bigger problems. It's this idea of Christian heresy called supersessionism. It's the idea that Christians now superseded Jews as God's chosen people. Now, as Christians, we can say, we believe that we have it right, that Jesus is the Messiah, that we should follow him, and that Jews did not follow Jesus as the Messiah. But if we say God no longer has chosen the Jewish people, and that God has abandoned them and chosen us, that becomes problematic. Because what's to say God can't say, you know what, there's a new thing now, you're out. Through Christian history, there's a lot of supersessionism in there. The idea of Jewish scapegoating, all the way up to Nazi Germany, it goes back hundreds of years and is based on this idea of supersessionism. Paul says, though, in Romans, like, hey, Christians, we're grafted onto the tree of Israel by God. We are adopted sons and daughters. But if you think for a second, well, if God can say you're out because you don't recognize this, you suddenly have no guarantee that the same can't happen to you. Everything is always dominoes. Every Supreme Court case affects future court cases. We're going to talk about one April 6th when we talk about free speech in here, Johnson versus Texas, and the idea of can you burn an American flag. Everything always has dominoes. So the question for the Alien Enemies Act is, what dominoes does this knock down if we suddenly say we're going to target people based on their nationality and not worry about innocence or anything yet because we're scared? Whenever we're fearful, we are not our best selves. So how can we find a way to do the good that we need to do? Because some people need to probably be in jail. Some people probably shouldn't be in the country. But always, how do we go about that? What roles does that open up? And the question is, what does faith have to say? And this is one where the Bible says a lot of things. There's not one answer that says, here's the answer on immigration from faith. There's a ton of scripture that says you need to welcome the foreigner and the alien among you. Treat them with respect. Love your enemy. That's a constant, right? We should always do that. But the scripture also maintains areas for borders for countries and has wars in there and what you do in these wartime situations. So it's never just a blanket thing. Everything is always contextual, which is why, as Christians, you have to really kind of see the whole picture of the Bible and keep your eyes on Jesus and say, okay, in this situation, what's right and what's wrong? And it's not always going to be the same. Maybe World War II was different from the Quasi-War. Context was different, right? There's no law enforcement agencies at all in 1798, really. There's a bunch in World War II. There's even more now. Context also make a difference. So it's always careful when you look at the Bible and just pull out a verse and say, hey, here's what it says. It's always more complicated than that. And how can you take the larger picture and try your best to apply it to any situation? And again, like the script today's sermon, try to do so right is not always easy in the midst of all the fear that surrounds you, because sometimes those fears are very real. Questions, comments, seditious remarks? I've been holding that one, yes.
And if these are dangerous, drug dealing, people who are dealing drugs and breaking laws in the United States, why can't they just be arrested? Why would they need the extra why would you collect all?
So I am not a political, judicial, or law enforcement scholar. I would say reading, I think the idea is that can take so much time and so much money and so much energy. So I think the idea from them is this is a quick way to quickly get rid of a threat, which is why they wanted to do it in 1798. Sometimes we want quick. Sometimes quick is good. But you can't always do things well quick. You know, I always say you can have cheap, quick, and good. You get 2 of the 3. You're not going to get 3 out of 3, especially when it comes to hiring. So I think that's the choice. And they're arguing we can do this quickly and across the board, get it done, versus the slow process. But that slow process is also in place to protect people who are falsely accused, like Anthony Ray Hinton. Like lots of people in the news recently who have been freed from death row because new evidence is found that they were wrongly imprisoned. There's a history of wrongful imprisonment in this country based on race, based on not just race, but class. You know, if you don't have the money to get a good defender, people just get to have a plea argument out. So the idea is to protect, the process is there to protect people. Some people want to go around the process because of an emergency. And we understand that at times, right, too. In our church, we have a CPR process that goes through a whole process if we use anything over $10,000. If there's something timely, we can go around that process and go straight to session onto all the committees because the session house is about to fall down. We can't wait 2 months. Let's do it. So anytime this is invoked, it's probably we have to get rid of these people now. That's obviously up to interpretation, though, and I can't speak to whether that's right or wrong because I don't have all the facts and I'm not a politician, jurist, or law enforcement agency. But that's their argument. We have to do this quickly. It's a war. We have to act decisively. The other side's saying it's not an actual war. We have a process to arrest them. If they're criminals, arrest them. Go through that. So, John was first, then Brian.
Sure, two questions. So the Alien Enemies Act, in that case, probable cause doesn't apply, or is the probable cause just because they have to be from that country? And along with that, the rest of this guy in New York, just basically for speaking in support of the Palestinians, and that's supposed to be considered, you can't say anything, you don't have First Amendment rights, so that, these.
So the New York case would not apply to the Alien Enemies Act. There's a whole other interesting legal case of free speech and everything, which we'll get to on April 6th, not necessarily that case, but the larger concept. For your question about due process, yes, in a war you don't have to have due process. So these wartime powers come into effect and you get rid of due process. So there's times when that has been helpful. When you're in a war emergency, you give emergency powers to people. Sometimes that's been good. There have also been times when emergency powers have gone really badly. Who remembers how Hitler got into power in Nazi Germany? A Reichstag fire happened. No one knows who started the fire or anything, but used that emergency to get emergency chancellor powers, which then led to everything else. Putin got into power the same way. You often use an emergency, often real emergency, or sometimes manufactured to grit fear and build up power. But there are times when you do have to circumvent the normal steps of things in an emergency. Sometimes it's just funding, right? We have a natural disaster. We don't want to go through months of funding. We're going to get the money right to these people. So again, sometimes emergency powers are needed for good. Sometimes they are abused. And that's the tough thing of government and life together. Brian.
I was going to say, the timing of this seems very suspect. Mahmoud Khalil, the protester from Columbia University, pro-Palestinian protester, was detained, taken to Louisiana, is being held, was almost deported, and finally got stymied and held up. And now suddenly we're after Venezuelan drug dealers, which seems something maybe they can get everybody behind. Now we can break down the barriers, we can get this Alien Enemies Act in work, and now we can retroactively apply it to Mahmoud Khalil and others like him who want to speak out against the government.
Yeah.
So the timing is suspect. They got this one case like, okay, how can we get it through? Let's go over here. We'll get everybody behind this one. Nobody likes Venezuelan drug dealers.
We don't think anyway, except for people who like drugs. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. You want to try to avoid the slippery slope logical fallacy, which is, always if you do a little bit, automatically you'll go to the end. That's a fallacy, but you also have to recognize that there are steps to things. And often you go small steps at once. Whether you talk about Russia, Germany, any place, you get people behind one thing everybody agrees on, and you just keep pushing the envelope. I see with my kids all the time. How much can I push this envelope? Okay, I got that. Now I'm going to go to here. Now I'm going to go to here. So it's going to be a test probably. It's not going to, if it's allowed, it's not going to end with that. It may be other drug lords. It may, countries and issues. It may eventually be declaring Palestinian activists as enemies of the state because they've caused personal harm and property damage. Again, as to Sandy's point, with Khalil, they could probably argue, I don't know all the facts, but there have been issues at Columbia of people being physically hurt because of the protesters. So now you've broken the law, you have that avenue to trigger deportation or imprisonment. But it takes a lot longer to go through. So that's where we have to kind of continue to hold to the Constitution and figure out, trust the process to a degree, but also at what point do we as a people, as a nation, how do we define an emergency situation? How much power do we give an emergency situation? You don't want to lose all wartime powers, but you have to keep them from being abused. And that's where you have to hope the Supreme Court always tries to hold the line in a nonpartisan way. That's the beauty, hopefully, of always having that 5-4 court and some one of those kind of swings to keep it from being political, because you want to have the nation trust its court is not political, but it's trying to really live by the Constitution. But it's hard, because even when we're trying to be objective, we're rarely objective. We're going to talk more about that with our book study on the righteous mind, how we think we're making rational and objective decisions, but it's really our gut feeling, and then we find the facts to support that gut feeling. Any other questions? So, yes?
I would love to hear if someone can share a logical argument why this would constitute an emergency invasion or predatory incursion, if anyone can help me with that, because I cannot even expand my brain to think how this would be considered that.
If anyone wants to, if not, I will take a stab at it.
Do it.
It isn't.
So, you know what?
Drug importation is way down, so this is a lie. It's a lie. There's one of 10,000, thousands and thousands of lies about what's happening in the country.
But there has to be a...
Yeah, I think the argument would be that drugs will continue to be a problem. We still have drug deaths. They're creating some violent there's violent activity, so let's nip this in the bud now, not go through all this process so we can have peace on our streets. You know, it's the same kind of argument that's often used. You appeal to fear and try to get things quicker. There's a lot. We're going to read, for our book in June, our reading with Pastor Stephen, we're going to look at a book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons for the 20th Century, that kind of details some of these different times in history where an emergency can come up and it can be abused, or how you appeal to fear to circumvent rights. And that's often the thing. We often give up our little bit of liberty for the feeling of safety. Here.
Actually, though, you have drugs, or theoretically, we have tariffs on Canada and Mexico to inhibit drug importation. So, if we're doing it with tariffs on Canada and Mexico, why are we doing it by rounding up and expelling drug sellers from Venezuela? There's a discrepancy.
I think they would probably argue that there's the border countries, a lot more coming in, the Venezuelans, gang leaders are already here. You want to deal with the problem that's here. You might look at tariffs later, but if they're already here, they can get drugs from the inside or even make the drugs here, so the tariffs won't affect it. They have to crack down on the making of drugs in the country. But again, I'm not an expert on drugs and drug cartels. I can only tell you the history of some of this stuff and like biblical. Ask me a Bible question, I got you. The larger drug questions y'all have among yourselves. All right, next week, no tiny topics, I'll be gone. The next one will be April 6th. We're going to talk about what is free speech, looking at it through the lens of Johnson v. Texas, where someone burned a flag outside one of the political party conventions, and that was against Texas law. And you get to see different arguments of what free speech is and what free speech isn't, and that could often be then interpreted to what does it mean today. And all these conversations about social media, about protests, about criticizing the government, everything else, you look at it through a lens of a historical Supreme Court case. Thank you all very much.